Hello and welcome to Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris. Today's guest is John Fitzgerald. You are in for a fascinating conversation. It opens, I ask him a quick question about jays, and we wind up having a long conversation about blue jays and green jays and Florida scrub jays and island scrub jays. John spent over 50 years studying Florida scrub jays, and it's a fascinating conversation. Speaking about longevity, John's first Christmas bird count was in 1957, 68 years ago. I don't know that anybody in the country's had a longer one, but man, that's just amazing to me. But he tells you about that. 29 years at Cornell, and he led the teams that developed eBird and Merlin, which are gifts to birders all over the country and all over the world. He certainly didn't do it alone, and he'll tell you who helped him. But he led those things, and that's fantastic. And last, he's going to tell us about the 7 new birds that he's discovered over the course of his career. 7 birds that he discovered, all of them in Peru. It's a great conversation. If you don't know John, you're going to enjoy getting to know him. If you do know John, you're probably going to find out some things you didn't know. Either way, it was a blast for me. Thanks for being with us today, and enjoy the upcoming conversation. Hello, and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris. We've got a good one lined up for you today. If you don't know our guest, you will when we're done, but you certainly know of some of his work. And so we're going to talk about that and share it. And I'm really looking forward to it. This is John Fitzpatrick. And as many of my guests have been, John is a guest also in the book, Why We Love Birds, which is where I learned a lot and got to meet John for the first time. So we're going to share a lot of the things that I learned there. And then I've got some questions that we didn't cover for the book or that have expanded beyond that. And so I'm looking forward to that. But John, before we get into the questions that I had prepared or the discussion points I brought up, I read in the news yesterday, and maybe you saw this, about a blue jay and a green jay hybrid outside of San Antonio, Texas.
That's a new one. No, that's an interesting.
Yeah, so this was in the news.
Super interesting because, as you know, that's the absolute northern edge of the range of the green jay.
Yes.
And frankly, blue jays aren't all that common down there either. So we had some years ago, probably 15 or more years ago, we had a very unusual in Florida hybrid between a blue jay and a Florida scrub jay. They bred for 2 years, produced a baby in each one of those years. And it was a scrub jay that was up near Jacksonville, way outside of its typical range. Obviously hard up for a mate. And so
and we're going to talk about scrub jays because I know that's a lifelong passion of yours. But on this, apparently, San Antonio, one of the things that has happened, or one of the things that was thrown out there as a possibility, is that with climate change, the green jays are moving a little bit north, and they have now broached San Antonio, if you would. And at the same time, with the change in temperatures and whatnot, the blue jays are moving south, and the two have met in San Antonio. And a woman there discovered, what was an odd looking jay. And of course, researchers, excuse the pun, flocked to her property and discovered that sure enough, it is a hybrid. And they, they'll be studying it and figuring out what to make of it. But I think this is probably the first of many of these things that we're going to be seeing over the next few years as far as.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this kind of hybrid is why I brought up the scrub jay, blue jay immediately, because this kind of thing it's not common, but where it occurs is often this thing where these two species are coming together just at the very edges of their ranges. And literally, both of them are hard up for a mate. And jays flock together.
Well, you know what? Let's go ahead and jump ahead. We'll come back to the questions in order later. But you've spent over 50 years studying Florida scrub jays. So
That's right.
Tell us what motivates a man to devote a half century to discussing a single endemic bird, and then tell us about the bird. Tell us what is so fascinating to you about this bird that has caused you to invest a lot of your professional and personal time in studying it.
Sure, happy to do it. I could probably use the whole hour talking about this. I started this sort of career-long obsession as a college sophomore in 1972. Where I was fortunate enough to get hired as an intern for the summer at Archbold Biological Station, Central Florida. where my then mentor, then becoming a 35-year-long friend, Glenn Wolfenden, had started banding Florida scrub jays at this beautiful, very, very important biological preserve. The Florida scrub jay, as many of your viewers know, is an endangered species. It's the only species of bird totally limited to Florida. It's now extremely rare and occurs only, literally only, on places where this dwarf oak scrub vegetation occurs on old sand dunes in Florida, peninsular Florida. So it's an ecological specialist. But before the advent of Western culture, Florida was covered with old sand dunes because it has periodically been inundated by the sea. And so it was pretty widespread across the peninsula. Come the 20th century, humans really depend on high, dry, sandy soils in Florida for agriculture, for residents, for golf courses, for theme parks, for everything under the sun. So that's
except scrub jays.
Yeah. The vegetation is now almost gone. It's, as I said some years ago to a company president, I was touring around there when he said, why are you trying to save it all? I said, sir, the pizza is gone. All we're trying to save is the crumbs left on the plate. And that's exactly what the scrub jay is limited to. It's an incredibly interesting bird, very social. Unlike the relatives in the West, it's a cooperative breeder, which got us started on it back in the 70s.
What does cooperative breeder mean?
The young don't leave home for a year or even 2 or 3 years. They instead stay with their parents on their 30-acre territories and live there and help raise the following year's offspring. So they live in an extended family system. Other species in North America that do this, red cockaded woodpecker, acorn woodpecker, brown-headed nuthatches, not very many.
The Harris's hawks do that?
Harris's hawks are, that's another interesting sort of system. The Harris's hawks have what's called a polyandrous or polygynandrous system where the females pair with multiple males, often brothers, and they hunt cooperatively. Slightly different evolutionary origins and ecological rationales, but yeah, they're another cooperative species in North America. Anyway, so for our first decade leading to the publication of our book back in the 90s, we were very interested in the evolution of cooperative breeding, especially given that very close relatives in the West don't do it. So what is it about Florida that brought this about? And we think now, cutting the story very short, it has a lot to do with the acorn storage system, with a cooperative sentinel system that the families take part in to keep them safe from predators. And also the fact, and here I'll get into this in a second, that the habitat is extremely fire prone. In its original extent and condition, Florida scrub was burning every 5 to 15 years. Florida is North America's ground zero for lightning strikes, 50 ground flashes of lightning per square mile per year, mainly in the summer. That starts fires. And in the past, this habitat was always burning. Well, it turns out that the Florida scrub jay absolutely, and this is something we've studied over the last decades. You asked why we can study a bird for so long. Well, it took us 20 years for our first experiment that proved that the Florida scrub jay is completely dependent on fire. Because once a fire comes through, it turns out, the offspring survival of jays that nest in the post-burn area doubles. And it stays high for the first 3 or 4 or 5 years. It begins to go down. And after 10 years, offspring survival is down below replacement rate. So they literally require freshly burned habitat in order to continue to persist in the population. And to be able to prove that without any debate, it took us 20 years for the first experiment. We published on that, and we've now repeated it in the same ground over the next 20 years. And we can see the natural fire cycle. So we were asking the Florida scrub jay to tell us what was the original fire frequency to which the Florida scrub jay, got evolved and adapted. And the answer is about every 10 to 15 years, the fire has to come through. That turns out same number that is required by a whole bunch of plant species, a whole bunch of arthropods down there. So we have now, using the jays and spiders and some flowers, we can now advise land managers across the state exactly what kind of fire frequencies they need to apply to their preserves in order to maintain a healthy scrub habitat. So in this respect, the Florida scrub jay is a spectacular example of an indicator species. We use it to indicate how the management of a habitat is going. If the
What
scrub
is
jay
the
down, then things are going wrong there. You've got to adjust your management.
So what is the habitat advantage of a recently burned area? What makes that appealing to a scrub jay and makes them more successful in their breeding?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's what we asked for several decades when it became clear that this was, or we were hypothesizing this was a situation. The answer is that there's no question we can watch them behaviorally be drawn to freshly burned areas and colonize them even within the first year after a fire, where basically it's black stalks and white sand. What happens is that the scrub is very quick to start regrowing. 80 or 90% of the biomass of the scrub habitat is underground. Plants, rhizomes, and root systems are underground because they know that they're going to be burned on a regular basis. So they're putting most of their energy down underground. After a fire, they quickly send up branches on which they will eventually grow flowers. And in the case of oaks, they'll grow acorns, which the scrub jays absolutely require. Every scrub jay on every territory in the Florida, every individual buries between 6,000 and 8,000 acorns every single late summer and early fall. They bury them across their 20 to 30 acre territories. Why? Because in the winter in Florida, which is dry and cooler, the insect population, which they typically rely on, goes down to near zero. So what they have is a alternating food source. Summer, they're eating bugs and frogs and katydids and all kinds of things. In the winter, they're eating acorns, which they buried months ago, hence the need to defend a year-round territory,
So
because the territory represents larder.
they can remember 6 to 8,000 locations for their acorns months ago. And I
Yeah.
can't find my
The
damn car key.
colleague of ours, DeGans, who did the definitive study on this some years ago, did some, just some spectacular patient work out there, counting the rate in which jays were burying acorns, and then also during on into the winter, counting the rate at which they dig them up. And so he calculated that they dig up about half of the acorns they bury. Now, by the way, they bury them across a 30-acre territory individually in various places across the territory. And they go back to those spots during the winter, and they're remarkable at their ability to look around and suddenly jump down, dig down into the sand, pull up an acorn. I buried an acorn there back in October, and they're doing that.
The corvids burying things, like I love the acorn woodpeckers and the way they'll go after an oak tree, and that's fascinating.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of blue jays on the property, and I feed them peanuts every day.
They're
And
hoarders.
pardon?
They're hoarders.
Yeah, but it is fascinating to watch them because they'll go and they'll look around, they'll hold the peanut, make sure no one else is watching, and then they'll bury it, and then the other jay that they didn't notice comes down and steals it. And what happens on our property is we have these little peanut plants growing by the hundreds around because they're unshelled peanuts, and so we can find where their favorite burying places are, and they'll bury them in pots and along the grass and where the flowers are, and
Love
so
this story. The corvids, the family that the jays are in, crows, jays, nutcrackers, magpies, they're spectacular at spatial memory. In fact, they are used by psychologists for understanding the evolution of memory, the neurological features of memory. The most incredible ones of all are the nutcrackers. In our North American case, the Clark's nutcracker, which is a hoarder, and they have this gular pouch, which they can fill up with the seeds of limber pine or white bark pine and fly miles to a spot where they can bury it, where in the winter, the south exposure is going to give them access to it. They have spatial memory that's vastly better than any human being that's ever been tested at the same, in the same sorts of experiments.
That's
amazing.
I mentioned, I think before the show, before we started recording, a woman named Christine Webb is just releasing right now a book called The Arrogant Ape. And humans are the arrogant ape. And one of the things she discusses is we're always trying to measure other animals' intelligence by what we think is important. And this is the kind of thing that's in her book is, yeah, we think we're real sharp, but let's see you remember where 6,000 acorns are.
Absolutely.
And so
Yeah.
it's an interesting twist. I'm very much looking forward to having her as a guest. Now, with the Florida scrub deer, I've seen them a handful of times, and you'll know the full name of the park, but Cruikshank.
Yeah, that's a place, the Alex Cruikshank State Park. It's that's over on the East Coast, just it's in Brevard County, and it's a place where now, over the last 10 to 15 years, the jay has become unusually common. And that sounds like a good thing, but in fact, Cruikshank is there's several different people around the state that study scrub jays recognize that that's a place where habitat destruction or failure to burn has caused a bunch of scrub jays to leave where they live, and Cruikshank is a sink. They're accepting a lot of scrub jays because it's the best place in town. On the West Coast, same exact thing is happening in Sarasota County at Oscar Shearer State Park, where at one time back in around the year 2000, there were 33 pairs of scrub jays in that little state park. Vastly too many to fit into that place, but it
Yeah, if
was
they
the
need a
only
30 acre
yeah,
territory.
yeah,
Um,
vastly too many for it was the only game in town, so it's a attractive spot for scrub jays. That Cruikshank is interesting because the fellow who studies the birds there, a guy named David Breininger, a good friend and longtime colleague, who's the expert on scrub jays in Brevard County, Florida, he is recommending that that's a particularly positive place to get jays, to borrow jays from, translocate to other habitats that have been restored but aren't being colonized.
well,
So
they'd be easy to trap. I mean, they're so used to people, they're landing on your head, and
yeah, you're right.
it's a zoo-like atmosphere. Now, I'm
You want to know
curious.
you want to know what our hypothesis for why they are so prone to landing on us?
Yes, I do, because I've had them land on my head.
Yeah, well, at Archbold we have them. We have them too. It's a sort of a culturally acquired habit, and we back of 20 years ago or so got a film of scrub jays foraging from the back of a deer, and so now since then we've heard people seeing them on the backs of wild boars, and that made us realize that before the arrival of humans in Florida 10,000, 12,000 years ago, Florida was covered with huge mammals, bison, giant sloths, glyptodonts, horses, camels, all these big mammals that used to lived in the era of the megafauna of North America, pre-humans. Florida scrub jays used the backs of those mammals to forage and probably maybe even forage off the ticks and insects that would be attracted to it by the mammals themselves. So we are now the big mammal in Florida. So it's pretty easy for a jay to start, as long as we're not hurting them, to start using us,
I was.
especially if they occasionally get a peanut as a
Yeah,
reward.
yeah, well, you're right. I was in Colorado a couple of weeks ago studying the elk for a mammal book I'm writing, and it's rut season in mid-September, and you can find the black-billed magpies riding along on the back of the elk,
Mm,
and
yeah,
I'm
same
sure
story.
it's like the oxpecker in Africa. They're probably cleaning the elk, but to your point, it's kind of a safe place to survey and see what else is out there. Now, staying on jays for a minute, and you're right, turns out we could spend an hour on jays.
Yep.
Do you know Scott Edwards over at Harvard?
Yes, absolutely. I know Scott very well.
So he's doing a study on the island jay on Santa Cruz Island. So it's interesting to me. We have an endemic jay that lives only on a relatively small island off the coast of Southern California. And I just got to see it and photograph it in April. I saw it a lot when I lived out there, but I went back and then you've got the one in Florida. Are there parallels between the island scrub jay and the Florida scrub jay? Other than obviously both
Really,
being jays, both being corvids.
really interesting question. Super interesting question because it's known several different groups of researchers have studied the island scrub jay over the course of the last few decades, and it's very clear that it is basically a California scrub jay that has gotten isolated on the islands and grown to be enormous. Has a similar social organization to the California scrub jay, with the one exception that because it's on an island, they just can't go anywhere they want. So they're stuck on the island. And instead of developing cooperative breeding on Santa Cruz Island, the island scrub jay juveniles leave home the way the mainland jays do, and they form roving groups of 20 to even 30 or 40 individuals that move around the local area and sort of overwhelm the local breeding jays. They have delayed breeding the same way the Florida scrub jay does because there's limited access to breeding. But a number of them do get to start breeding at age 1 in kind of the peripheral habitats, and then they work their way into the better habitats over the course of their lives. It's a different social organization that is created by somewhat similar kinds of ecological constraints.
Okay. So, question for you. I've asked it before and not received a satisfactory answer, nor have I done the research on my own, but they are endemic just to Santa Cruz Island. And only
Well,
3 miles away is Anacapa Island, but they don't seem to cross that bridge. And the mainland's only 20 miles away.
yeah. So Anacapa is a pretty small and very rocky island. It's really great for seabird nesting, but not that great for, doesn't really have a lot of oaks on it.
Okay.
Remember, the scrub jays are nut dependent jays, and almost all the scrub jays are restricted to oak habitats. There are some pinyon adapted scrub jays in the Woodhouses scrub jay complex. But let me just make sure to clarify, the scrub jay today is limited to Santa Cruz Island, the biggest of the Channel Islands. But if you look to the west, out there in that cold water west of Santa Cruz is Santa Rosa Island.
Yep.
And there's no doubt that the scrub jay used to occur on Santa Rosa. There are some very recent they're basically recent bones prove that the scrub jay used to be out there, and probably were out there on the third island, even west of Santa Rosa. And so when humans started colonizing those islands, they basically denuded Santa Rosa, essentially took away all of the oaks. And that wiped out the scrub jay on Rosa. There's a number of us who are still pushing the national park system to go ahead and permit the reintroduction of scrub jays onto Santa Rosa, because they in turn could reseed the island with acorns because of what we just talked about, the fact that they bury acorns. And that's actually, from a conservation standpoint, we think a very important thing to do, because West Nile virus, which is extremely lethal to the western scrub jay, has not gotten out to Santa Cruz Island. Those birds have been restricted to Santa Cruz Island for, the genetics tell us, 200,000 to 300,000 years at least. So they're completely naive to viral pathogens. If West Nile virus gets out onto Santa Cruz Island, there's a real fear that it could actually sweep across and do in the island scrub jay. So it's really, we're overdue to getting the permits to get island scrub jays back out onto Santa Rosa as keeping all our marbles into several places instead of one.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you for that. I'm glad we opened with a question about jays. I figured it would be easy to get you to chat about it. Let's back up a couple of years. You grew up in rural Minnesota, and if memory serves from our conversations previously, your spark bird was an American redstart?
That's right. I was home from kindergarten, sick one day in the spring. So I was probably 5 and saw a orange and black bird out the window, pretty close range. And somehow I had already gotten into my head that there are things called orioles. And I said, "Is that an oriole?" And my mom and dad had the Peterson 1954 edition of Peterson's Eastern Field Guide, and I looked that up, running through the field guide, found the bird that was right out there, and it was American redstart. And that, to this day, I can remember, wow, it's a redstart. And then it's like, my God, look at all these other birds illustrated on that same page as the redstart. And then turn the page, and there's another bunch of colorful birds. And I just remember saying, I want to see all those other ones. Honestly,
You'd spent a lifetime trying to do that.
I was hooked. I will also just say that in part, my obsession, or whatever this is, a compulsion or hobby,
we'll call it focus,
was encouraged because my parents had several friends, in particular the famous wildlife artist Francis Lee Jaques and his wife, his wonderful wife Florence.
That was my next question for you.
Yeah. Well, they had come from New York. He's a famous artist who painted the backgrounds at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. In the 40s, he left New York and came back to Minnesota, which was his roots. We happened to grow up right across the pond from him, so in walking distance. And they were bird watchers, and so they sort of inculcated a small group of my parents' friends, and so we had kind of a little group that were kind of casually interested in bird watching, and that helped spur me on. So my mom and dad, when I learned that the Christmas bird count was occurring, and let's see, that was December of 1957. I went out on my first Christmas bird count in 1957, hosted by the Jakewees, the evening thing hosted by the Jakewees. And I haven't missed a Christmas bird count year since. So
That's a lot of Christmas bird. I imagine there's not a longer streak in the
I don't
country.
know. We can put it out there and say, does anybody have a streak that goes back longer than 1957?
Yeah, 68 years. 68 years. Okay. Now you also have mentioned that you've got red-breasted nuthatch as your favorite bird.
That's right. I just came from Minnesota this last weekend where there were 4 or 5 red-breasted nuthatches over my head calling just constantly, talking to me.
So what is the
That bird eluded me for an unusually long period. So, early teenage years, I think, before I finally found a red-breasted nuthatch. Speaking of Christmas bird counts, I used to hear that a couple of families along the St. Croix River who would report every time red-breasted nuthatch. I think, how do they see these things? I can't find them one of those things. I finally found a couple of them in a pine stand with my mom on a Christmas count. And I adore them. You're always in a cool place when you see them or hear them. They're from certain years, a lot of them move southward. So occasionally they get down as far as Texas in the wintertime, but that's pretty rare. Anyway, very nifty little bird. Love that little high nasal sound. They're uncommon, but you can find them in the right habitats. And I always love where I am when I encounter that bird.
That's a neat way to put. I've asked that question of a lot of people about their favorite bird, and that's the first time that somebody has brought up, I like where I am when I see them. That's a neat way to look at it. I'm going to put some more thought to that. That's kind of cool. Now, you had told me once before that your career is kind of broken up into 3 stages. And the first one was with the Field Museum in Chicago. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. I got that job while I was in graduate school. I was doing my PhD research as a Princeton grad student on the largest family of birds, the tyrant flycatchers. There are 420 species of them. And I was doing a project on the evolution of adaptive radiation of this huge family of birds that vary from the smallest songbird in the world up to shrike-sized things and kiskadees and things. And got the job before I even finished my PhD. So I had to actually hurry up and finish, and got the job in 1978. Field Museum is one of the world's very great natural history museums. I began as an assistant curator of the bird division, ended up becoming chairman of the zoology department before moving out. So during that period, I was working a lot in South America, continuing to work in South America, doing some expeditions into remote areas of Peru, especially discovering a series of undescribed species during
We're
that
gonna
period.
go through that. There's 7 of them, and I'm excited. Let's get through the career
Yeah.
part, and then we'll get to Peru. So
Okay, good. So yeah, during that period, that entire period I was in Chicago, I kept going with the Florida Scrub Jay project as a sort of a second major research focus of mine. So I kind of had 2 research foci. And so late in the game, after I got married and we had a couple of kids, and I really couldn't do those big Amazonian expeditions anymore with a young family. And I was also beginning to recognize the incredible conservation crisis that was developing in Florida with the massive human population growth and the loss of their great natural resources. So when the opportunity arose, I chose to switch my job and become director of the Archbold Biological Station in Central Florida, which is a world-class, very, very famous and spectacularly important ecologically place. When I got there, I started a new facet of Archbold, which is now a major part of their research, which is that we first leased for 30 years and now own a big 10,000-acre cattle ranch on which we're studying the ecology of cattle ranching, which is an important industry in Florida and an important lifestyle for lots of Floridians. Archbold kind of attracted me. The conservation issues in Florida attracted me, and I moved down there in 1989, and super happy. Got a lot of things done. Started some really important projects. We got going on a national wildlife refuge specifically for the Florida scrub that is now well established. And then I got called by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I couldn't resist exploring the possibility of moving to Cornell, which is, as everybody who's listening to this and knows about birds, they know it's been the mecca for scientific ornithology as well as amateur engagement for 100 years.
Now, and for you, that was a short little 29-year stint, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Now,
I got into the lab in 1995, to the Cornell Lab in 95. I mean, the short stint was only 7 years as director of Archbold. But the opportunity to be at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in Sapsucker Woods, to be engaged with great graduate students and great colleagues at a place that is specifically designed to be both professional ornithology on the scientific side, but also engage with the amateurs and basically crosswalk between citizen engagement in nature and professional ornithology. That sort of intersection, which is a hallmark of the Cornell Lab and has been since its founding by Arthur Allen back in the early 20th century, pushed all my buttons, literally. I looked at and rejected several other opportunities to move away and just said that what this place represents is exactly what my life is devoted to. I'm a passionate hobby bird watcher since that Red Start. Yes, I keep a life list. Of course, I keep it on eBird now. We'll probably get to that too.
We'll mention it.
Yeah. But I'm also, I got to Cornell at a time when I had pointed out to the dean that hired me that the reputation of the lab was vastly exceeding its performance at that time. That's a line that he never forgot. And I mused with him about what I thought the world's greatest center for ornithology should look like, and got hired with that interview. And we've just worked on it ever since. I mean, it's still today. I retired as director in 2021 and retired from my professorship just a couple of years ago, last year. But it's still doing phenomenal stuff in a variety of places and ways. We have global partnerships now. We have 300 people at the lab. We dreamed in 1995 about this being unequivocally the world's best center for the study, the appreciation, the conservation of birds, and the engagement of the citizens of the world in appreciating birds and nature. And that's what the lab is right now.
And continues to grow.
Still gives me goosebumps, actually, to just think, to appreciate my good fortune in being able to be here.
Well, and our good fortune that you were there. So there were a lot of accomplishments in 3 decades of work. But I would have to imagine you would agree that the signature accomplishment was eBird and then Merlin, which, to your point, the crosswalk between scientists and ornithologists and the regular folk like me, the citizen science and citizen scientists, which, is a kind of a point of pride. Every time I send in a checklist, I think I'm helping some grad students somewhere, But eBird, for relatively new birders like myself, eBird was just there. I woke up, there was a Sibley app, there was Merlin, there was eBird. I'm thinking, what's so hard about this? This is a pretty easy hobby. I can't believe people have said it's challenging. I don't get it. Now, I've since my arrogance and ignorance have been exposed since then. But nonetheless, tell us about because the eBird is magical. And not everybody who watches this is a birder. But there are other things that are in that realm, iNaturalist and different things. So tell us about eBird, what motivated it, how long did it take, and then what's the tremendous value of it today?
Well, I'm going to start by tipping my hat to my longtime friend and colleague, Frank Gill. Frank, when I got to Cornell in 1995, was the same time that a guy named John Flicker became head of National Audubon. We had known each other in Florida. We both moved to New York at the same time. And Flicker asked me right away, tell me somebody that you might recommend we could hire as our chief scientist at Audubon. And I said, without batting an eye, I said, you should talk to Frank Gill, who at that time was at the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Science. And they hired Frank, who was in many ways similar sort of background to me, a passionate birder, hobby birder from childhood, but also a terrific scientist, very well-known scientist for a lot of his work through the decades. And Frank and I immediately, when Frank got up to New York, we started talking about the idea, because remember, the internet, when I got to Cornell, I did not use email and we had no website. That was 1995. I mean, it seems like that's the Pleistocene, right? But it was 1995, and the internet was just starting to become a popularly used thing. And pretty quickly in our joint, thinking about things to do together, because Audubon, let's face it, great conservation organization, 100 years old. Its mission and our mission, very complementary, very sort of side by side. What could we do together that would take advantage of this new thing called the internet? And so we started talking about what ended up becoming a precursor to eBird, which we named Bird Source at the time. And we, being at Cornell, where there's a lot of high-end computer science and computer applications people here, we said, let's give it a shot. We hired, jointly funded for the first couple of years, we hired a few hot shots with programming and got the first things going that gave us the idea to run something we called the Great Backyard Bird Count. So by 1997, we were experimenting with that thing, which was in February. We placed it in February because that's the lowest point of news in the annual cycle. But it's also the point at which birds get as far south as they're going to go, and then they start coming back. We crashed the entire Cornell computer system that weekend, literally. So all the Cornell people were saying, what the hell is going on out there? There's so much attention to this thing that it completely broke our computer systems. That led to a couple of years of my trying to, with colleagues at the lab, trying to get National Science Foundation support, some generous NSF support, to try to really build an unbreakable version of this stuff. Remember also at that time, the computer languages used on the internet were changing very quickly. Java, JavaScript, the programming languages, C++ was giving way to bigger things. And so stuff was changing so rapidly that we really needed to have real experts on the staff. So, we began to hire more tech people than we hired bird people. We clearly needed database expertise. Cornell University supplied. We robbed a few other places of that. So we finally got the big NSF grant that was instrumental, which allowed us to completely recreate the original Bird Source thing. The Cornell lab basically took over the funding of this whole project. And ultimately, we launched eBird as a U.S.-based bird checklist program in 2002. So for the first 8 years...
Continental U.S. or all 50 states?
It was actually North America. It was Canada, U.S. and Canada. Mexico, great colleagues in Mexico, and a lot of interest on our part in Latin American birds, ornithology, conservation. Mexico was the first one to tap on our shoulder and say, could you do this for Mexican birds too? So we expanded it to Mexico during the mid-2000s. And then we said, you know what? We got to expand this to the whole world. It was working. It was growing at that during those years from 2002 to 2010. It was growing at 30-40% annually compounded in its usage, both in terms of checklists being submitted and total bird observations being made. Now, by the way, 23 years later, we're getting 2 million or more checklists a month from all over the world. So 2010, we had finally mastered a couple of things we had to, namely, what's the global bird checklist look like? And that changes all the time, right? So we needed to have a full-time systematist keeping us up to date with the regularly changing names of birds and so on, and build a database that was capable of managing that. So we've investing in this thing constantly, and we still are. And also key, I want to tip my hat to a couple of people whom we hired in 2005, namely Chris Wood, who's still with us as the project leader, associate director of the avian conservation and avian population studies program there. But Chris Wood and another guy named Brian Sullivan, who both competed for the job of eBird project leader in 2005. They impressed us, and I just said, well, let's hire them both. So Brian and Chris became the co-leaders of eBird. Chris is now the head of our online avian publication work called Birds of the World, and a terrific guy. These are both terrific guys, very knowledgeable, and they are the ones who in 2005 said to me, you got to stop trying to make eBird a citizen science project. You got to make eBird something that birders want and birders need and birders love. And so the phrase became around the lab, eBird became an incredibly successful citizen science project when it stopped trying to be a citizen science project.
I think that's a lesson for a lot of us in a lot of different things.
Yeah. You got to make something. This was huge, and we still learn about this today. You got to make this usable. You got to be listening more than telling, so that we can start. We're constantly getting birders saying, "Why can't we keep our life list checklist on this thing?" Sure, can we make? And then we started realizing, the kind of good-natured contests. Who's got the biggest eBird life list? What's going to make people actually start putting checklists in? Then we also, from a scientific standpoint, we increased the ability of eBird data to be used for statistical analyses of bird numbers and bird movements. And to do that, you need something that you still don't use on iNaturalist. iNaturalist is an observation-based community science project, super important and fantastic. eBird is a checklist-based project. As an eBirder, all of your viewers know, if you're eBirders, how important it is to punch yes to the question, is this a complete checklist? Is this counting every single bird you detected? It's also keeping track of your time and your distance. So it's a complete checklist with time and distance data automatically included in it. That, plus the masses of checklists that one gets, supplies phenomenal power to the statisticians, who can then start playing with it and correlating it with the various things like land use and weather and stuff, to be able to actually make incredibly detailed analyses of occurrences and abundances, changes in distribution through the seasons, and ultimately now what we refer to as the holy grail that we wanted to evolve into, the ability to actually look through time, because now we're getting enough data for given places that we can actually look through time and ask the question, what are these populations doing? And we can now ask that question at 27 kilometer scaled pixels. So now, with the very first time, some of the most important papers of the many, many hundreds of papers that have been published on eBird data, the most important ones are coming out now because they are giving us the opportunity to look at population changes at very local scales and be able to see across the range of every species in North America, ultimately the world, where is it doing well and where is it doing badly, allowing us then to go in and figure out why is that true here versus not there. So all of this is a consequence of being passionate bird watchers who said we should develop a national checklist. That was the original phrase that was used.
Thank you for.
When I first got to Cornell, I got visited when I first got to Cornell. Within the first couple of months of my being there in 1995, Rick Bonney and Ken Rosenberg came into my office and said, we should begin to develop a national checklist. And I literally remember saying at the time, what are we going to learn that we don't already know? I mean, that's a lot of work to start doing a national checklist. At that time, we would have to be by U.S. Postal Service, right? Anyway, what a silly question for me to have asked at that time.
Well, I don't think it was. I think that's the kind of question that forces people to come up with an answer. So a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned earlier that John is a guest in my book, Why We Love Birds, which I'm grateful for. One of the other guests in that book is a young man named Ethan Kang. Ethan is a 17-year-old high school junior, and I wanted to focus a couple of the chapters on some of the younger birders. One of his great points of pride, and he's only been birding about 4 years, he has an 1,100 plus day run of sending an eBird checklist. He has not missed a day in over 1,100 days. And he's a young, this guy is,
he's into it.
If you were looking to hire somebody 7 years from now, you would hire Ethan. but 1,100 plus consecutive days.
That's true.
He said, every morning before I go to school or before, if it's summer, whatever I'm going to do, I get up and at least do my local neighborhood. And
How old did you say he is? How old is he?
17-year-old young man.
Hey, man, his name's Ethan, right? Ethan,
Yes.
I hope you're thinking about coming to Cornell for college.
You know what? And it's great that, okay, now we're in trouble because when I asked him about college, he said, I have one number one choice and it's Cornell. So I'm going to make
All right.
sure that Ethan sees this and maybe even sends you a note of hello and gratitude.
Yeah.
But backing up now on the citizen science stuff, and I realize, I use eBird a lot when I'm traveling somewhere and I get to travel a lot and helps me research in advance what I might see and, look
Yeah.
into that. And it's fantastic. And I know that a lot of people are using it to write white papers and serious academic things. And there's a lot of information that's available just to regular hobbyists like myself. Is there a deeper level of information that you guys are analyzing and creating at Cornell? And if so, is that available if I'm a doctorate student at LSU? Do I have
yeah.
access to that?
Yes, that's a really important question, Scott. The data early on and to this day, one of our commitments was that the data from the eBird database is publicly available. So anybody, professional, amateur, student, non-student, whoever, if you want to analyze eBird data directly from the source, come and get it. We get tens of thousands of downloads. The eBird database actually is a major contributor annually to the global biological information system called GBIF. So the data are publicly available always, and
Okay.
just contact us. I think there's probably places on the. In fact, I know you can. This is on the eBird website under Science, the tab called Science. By the way, that's where you would go if you want to get information on how to download the data or who to contact if you want more info on it. But that Science tab, I encourage everybody, if you haven't done it, to go to the Science tab. I mean, one of the most important things that you can do on that Science tab is what I was just describing. You can go to any North American species and ask it to show you its global annual year-round distribution. You can see the 52-week animation of its movement patterns. And now, increasingly, for most of the species, you can see the most recent analyses of what I was describing earlier, namely the population trends at very tiny local scales. A recent paper, I think it was in April or May this last year in Science. I told this group of co-authors of this, the most important paper that's come out of eBird yet was published in Science that basically showed the number of things about population trends of birds in North America, most alarming of which was the declines in the large number of species that are declining. They are declining most rapidly in the places where they are most common, which is like, that's not supposed to be. Traditionally, we would have thought that when things get tough out there, birds tend to decline first and most in the places at the edges of their range.
Yeah, on the fringes.
Not true. For the vast majority of the birds in North America whose populations are declining, the declines are most rapid in the center of the population range and in the places where the birds are most common. So counterintuitive. Look at American robin. Look at cardinal. Actually, cardinal's not declining that much, but look at great blue heron, a rapidly declining species of North American bird, and it's declining the most in the places where the heron is the most common. And this is true for species after species. So we don't even know why that's true right now. But remember when I asked, what are we going to learn that we don't already know?
Mm-hmm.
That was 25, 30 years ago. It's like, are you kidding me? We're learning a huge amount about birds. And it's all because committed bird watchers. Birds attract people to nature, right? And just getting a little bit of that, enough of your time to say, yeah, I'm going to put what I'm seeing down here and send it in. And it turns out that the Earth has potentially now 6 or 7 billion adult sensors called humans. And if even a tiny fraction of those actually put down what they're seeing and hearing in the organized way, we now have, for the first time in the Earth's history, a system by which we can actually monitor how things are going in the world, because birds are such good indicators of the larger pictures of climate and habitat change and so on. So The public talk that I often give nowadays is called "Wild Birds Are the Canaries, and Our Planet is the Coal Mine."
I wonder how old
Not a
you
bad.
have to be to get that reference. I don't know. I don't know if Ethan Kang, for example, is familiar with it, but
Yeah.
it's
So, but of course, I always start the talk with a picture of the guys in the mine with a canary.
yeah,
So it's
exactly. Exactly. All right. So you have what I consider a companion piece of software or sister piece of software, which is Merlin,
game changer.
which
Game changer.
if eBird didn't exist, Merlin would be a freaking awesome piece of software for birders. So tell us about Merlin.
Well, quickly, I want to just mention that because eBird exists, Merlin can be so much better because assuming that you're online or have connectivity somehow, cellular or Wi-Fi, anytime you open Merlin and start doing anything with it, it knows where you are from the GPS satellite. And therefore, and it goes immediately to the eBird database and says, well, here's the universe of things that you could be seeing. So it's immediately taking it down. Can you imagine if you had to identify a bird in your backyard and all you had was a book full of all the birds in the world, 11,000 species? So, you want to start with the stuff that you know is around you. Merlin is intended mainly for the people who are just learning how to identify birds. That's how it got started. The small group of individuals at the Cornell Lab, headed by our wonderful senior communications person, Miyoko Chu, had this idea to write an NSF proposal that would help create an app that would help people to identify the birds they're seeing. Originally by just answering a couple of questions. What size is it? Where is it? And name 3 colors that it has. I saw that proposal. Miyoko remembers this, I'm sure, as well as I do. And I said, I just don't think NSF's going to fund this. I don't see this being compelling enough and general enough for NSF to fund. Well, they funded it. The rest is history.
And it's a miracle. So again, for those of you who aren't birders, if you are a birder, I have to imagine you're familiar with Merlin, but perhaps you're not. So Merlin is a program provided by Cornell. Is there any cost to it? I can't remember.
It's free.
It's free.
No, it's free.
So
there's a story there. When I said, we're not going to let Merlin out the door until I think it's amazing. And 4 or 5 or 6 other of the major bird heads at the lab think it's amazing. And it got to that point. This was before the sound. It was even before the image recognition. It was just basically that basic first, plain vanilla. It got to that point and I said, wow, this is amazing. How much are we going to charge for? Is it going to be like cheap, like $4.95, or are we going to go high end, like $29.95? And they came back to me and said, we think we should give it away for free. And I said, what? We just spent $3 million building this thing.
Well,
the key is,
thank you to
Cornell. Goes wild.
Thank you, Cornell. Thank you, NSF, the National Science Foundation, and thank you to John. Now, again, so that you know, I use Merlin all the time. If you're not familiar with Merlin,
I used it this morning.
It's an app that's free, and there are 3 ways you can identify birds. The one that John mentioned, you can go through and put in about 6 or 8 facts, your location, the date. It gives you an easy way to put size and color, and is it flying or swimming or messing around in the ground. And then it gives you suggested birds based on the time of year and the location and the information you've shared. There's a second one where you can skip all that and just put a picture in and say, here's a picture I just took. What the heck am I looking at? And by the way, if you want to have fun, don't put your geographic location and put the picture in and see what birds around the world Merlin thinks it might be. But the third one to me, and this one's magical. So if you're familiar with Shazam for music, right? You're hearing a song, you don't know what it is. You put Shazam, you go, that was from the Shirelles and da-da-da-da. That's what they're doing with Merlin. So you click record, and now your phone, generally it's on a phone, I assume, your phone is starting to listen to the birds in the area. It's established where you are, and it's telling you, here's what we're hearing. Now, a lot of people just cheat, frankly, and use that as their eBird list. I use it as a monitor to say, okay, I think this is what I heard. I'm not a great ear birder, but I'm pretty sure this is what I heard. And then I look and go, oh, Merlin heard the same thing. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But
by the way, we discourage people from using it as strictly their eBird checklist because it still makes mistakes. I just had this fall, for example, I kept getting brown thrasher call note being logged as a brown. It was not a brown thrasher, but it kept saying brown thrasher when it would hear this note by a catbird. And, and the guys are the guys, the women, the men and women in the Macaulay Library who are working on this constantly now. And we have a whole team of people now making this better and better. About every 2 weeks, they're releasing new algorithms that correct for some of these errors that come in. And beta testers, like I'm one of a few hundred of them, keep sending, this chip is misidentified. So
Well, and
it's
also,
constantly. So anyway, it's an assistant.
it is, and you're not supposed to use it as your eBird checklist. I mean, that's because you didn't hear those birds or you didn't identify them.
You can use it to help your eBird checklist for sure.
Well, what I do with it a lot is, especially if I'm in an area I'm unfamiliar with, then I'll use it and it'll alert me to a bird that I'm not familiar with. Then I'll run over to the Sibley app and check the sounds and say, okay, David, what does this sound like? And now I'm going, okay, now I want to listen to this because Merlin's telling me there's a red-breasted nuthatch out there. I'm not familiar with that, that high-pitched thing. And so then I confirm it and then I listen and that helps me. But
By the way, Scott, you can confirm it right on your Merlin list.
I know
So
that.
go to
You know what? I
Expert.
didn't realize that at first. Now I got in the habit and I don't break habits easily. So there you go. But you're right. I can do it right on Merlin. But the other thing I use it for, pardon?
If you hit Explore instead of Identify, you hit the Explore thing at the bottom, and then you get to the species. Then you just run down, and we've got 6 or 8 or even a few dozen in some cases, like song sparrow, of the different sounds that they make.
Which
so
is
right on there.
Which is awesome. And the other thing I use it for, and this is just for me personally, so right outside the window I'm looking at, out onto our lake, we've got a screened in porch, and either I'll go out there in the afternoon and read, or my son and I'll go out in the evening and have a cigar and sit. And we both fire up Merlin, not to confirm that we're hearing our normal cardinals and thrashers and jays and, wrens and stuff, but I'll look down every few minutes to see if it's hearing something that is unusual, either for time of year or maybe it's a yard bird. And then I can say, oh, you know what? We got to put aside this discussion of the Packers. And I think there's a chance that we've got an XYZ. Let's go look. Let's go listen. So it's a trigger for me, a positive trigger. I know trigger's taken on a negative connotation to a lot of people, but it's positive because frankly, it's for lazy birding because I'm not birding. I'm having a conversation and a cigar with my son. But while I'm out there, I let Merlin do some work, and it has helped me find a couple of
absolutely
birds that I wouldn't have caught.
I mentioned earlier that it was originally created as an assistant for people who are just learning how to identify birds, and of course, it's extremely helpful for that. And it has, I think more than 35 million people have downloaded it now because of the sound thing. That's gone. It's just a game changer. But I want to point out that I'm 74, and I've had extremely good hearing, and I'm pretty good ear birder. That's how we had identified a couple of new species, actually. But I'm 74, and I've lost things right around 7,500, 7,800 hertz. I can't hear them anymore. Cedar waxwings, I got to be within a few meters of that bird for me to hear it now. Brown creepers, the main little whistle song, gone. Golden crown kinglets, I get them because of by ear because of Merlin now.
Right.
And
that's,
so for those of your viewers who are in my kind of condition where the upper frequencies are starting to get weak or disappearing, Merlin gives you a full picture of what's out there, even though you can't hear it.
Yeah, it's if you're not using it, it's a magical. They're both, eBird and Merlin, are magical tools. Now, we've been talking about technology for a while here, John. Let's shift to what some people would say is the exact opposite of technology, which is art. I'm not sure those two aren't equivalent, but nonetheless, you are also an artist. Is that right?
Yeah, these pictures behind me, that's one of my old Springer Spaniels, and that's the Royal Sun Angel that we described that we discovered in 1976 in northern Peru. I painted those. I didn't paint that picture of my mom in her youth, but yes, a huge part of that was because I got to know Jaques when I was a young kid. He was my childhood hero. I recognized later that he was my childhood hero, and I got to sit at his knee, so to speak, and he could correct how I was making the form of birds and bird wings. And he's the one who described to me that birds have 10 primary feathers, and I got to sit and watch him on his easel, mixing colors and doing, painting occasionally. And so I I just couldn't resist doing it. So I started doing it then, and remember being caught in second grade doodling bird pictures instead of what I was supposed to be doing. And
It's
yeah,
funny, the list of things I got caught doing when I was in second grade that I wasn't supposed to do weren't nearly as productive as your list. Okay, so we have, and by the way, if you want to send me, if you've got a couple of pictures on your phone of a couple of your pieces of work, please send it.
yeah,
We're gonna go into production today, but I can drop those pictures in and share those with the audience. I'd love to do that, please, John. All right.
yeah, sure.
I have been withholding from the audience what I consider an unbelievable feat by John Fitzpatrick, as if developing eBird and Merlin and studying scrub jays for 50 plus years wasn't enough. Recently, I had as a guest Peter Kastner, who I'm sure you know, John, the only man in
Absolutely, yeah.
the history of the world to have seen 10,000 birds. I mean, he's actually down in South America now, trying to add to that. But Peter discovered a bird in the late 1980s in the Andes Mountains, and the bird wound up being named after him, not at his request, but to honor him. And I just thought that was incredible to meet somebody who discovered a species that was previously unknown, that none of us had seen or heard about or read about or drew or photographed or anything. We just didn't know it was there. There were 11,000 birds one day. And then Peter came home and there was 11,000. Our guest today, John Fitzpatrick, did not find one or two or three, but discovered 7 new species of birds, which I am still in awe of from our last conversation. But share that with the audience, what it's like to discover multiple species of birds. And Peru was the home of 6 of the 7?
Yeah, actually all 7.
All 7, okay.
Mine. And by the way, the 7th is a contested one because I described it as a subspecies. People who've now studied it since consider it a species, so it goes back and forth still. But yeah, the first one was you asked the question, what's it like? It's pretty damn cool.
By the way, that should be the name of your autobiography.
It's pretty damn cool. The first one that got us started was in 1975 when I was a graduate student at Princeton with John Turborg as my major professor. We had decided to, in the early part of our summertime trip, to do a little bit of a lark expedition to a previously unexplored mountain ridge in northern Peru called the Cordillera del Condor, the Mountain of the Condor. A small ridge east of the main Andean slopes, and we got up there with some considerable work to get to near the top of the ridge. And my colleague and I, Dave Willard, who's still a collection manager, now retired, but still at the Field Museum in Chicago, he was at Princeton at the time too, and we put out mist nets to see what was there. Our first day there, and eagerly went out the next morning and opened the nets, diddled around in the woods for a while we let things happen. And on our way back to breakfast, we came back through our nets, and the very first bird we took out was a wren, lower shelf. I can still remember it, right? Lower shelf of the mist net. We took this wren out. Dave and I both looking at it saying, well, it's a wood wren. It has a little short tail the way the wood wrens do, but it's got 2 bold white wing bars and a white edge to the outer wing feathers. And we said, well, there's no wood wren with wing bars. In fact, there's only one wren in the whole South America that has wing bars, and it's a treetop bird. What is this thing? It's undescribed. So we walked back, took a few birds out on our way back. We walked back in with this bird in our hands saying, hey, folks, back in camp, you want to see an undescribed species? So to take a bird out right off the bat and know for sure this is a new bird, that's pretty mind-blowing. I'll just say quickly what happened next. We got a few specimens of that and took it back to the U.S., confirmed that it was a new species of wood wren, named it the bar-winged wood wren. On that same trip, at that same camp, we were seeing a pretty common hummingbird. You see it now back up there, right?
Actually,
all dark purple blue. We had at that time, 75, there was no good field guide to South American birds. There were some rudimentary efforts at written descriptions of birds, mainly by Rudolf Meyer de Schauensee, but useless for most of our, tough idea. So at the very end of that trip, I decided, okay, I'd never skinned a hummingbird before, but I made one specimen of this blue hummingbird with a forked tail. Took it back to the U.S. along with those wood wrens, and we couldn't identify it. And we took it down to Smithsonian, where the world's hummingbird specialist was, Richard Zusi. He didn't know what it was. He didn't even know what genus it was in. So I said, well, let's go back. So we went back the following summer, 1976, and caught the female of this bird, which showed us for sure that it was in the genus Heliangelus, the sun angels. Named it ultimately the Royal Sun Angel, my favorite color, royal purple blue. At that same camp, and that summer we were with John O'Neill, the LSU, the famous ornithologist from Louisiana State, and we caught 3 other undescribed species that second trip. So we caught the little flycatcher that we named the cinnamon-breasted pygmy tyrant. We caught screech owl, which we named after Roger Torrey Peterson, the cinnamon screech owl, and we caught brush finch, which I named as a subspecies, named it after my Harvard mentor, Ray Painter. A white crown. It's a part of the complex of white-winged brush finches. So we had 5 total new birds from that mountain ridge over 2, 10-day periods in 2 years. Amazing.
Yeah, I would say so.
The other 2 are both from southeastern Peru. One's a little flycatcher in the treetops that I knew we should find eventually because, of all things, John Terborg and his colleague John Wesky, years before, had captured this bird in another mountain ridge in eastern Peru. They took a picture of it and let it go. They didn't know what it was. Well, I knew what it was. It was an undescribed flycatcher. And so I also knew that it was probably in the genus Philoscartes or Pogonotrichus. And lo and behold, 1980, in that of southeastern Peru, where we were working on 2 different mountain ridges, well, I heard eventually and then saw this little bird, very high treetop flycatcher, and said, there it is. That's the same bird that Terborg and Wesky caught and let go. And we managed to secure several specimens of it. And that's the, which we named after Ted Parker, our wonderful, dear, very close friend and amazing person who was struck down in the prime of his life in a plane crash. And then the final one was the very, really neat ant bird which we named the Manu ant bird because we first found it in the Manu National Park, one of the great national parks in the world. So yeah, there's a maybe not so quick. That's 7.
That's remarkable, John. Congratulations. That's a pretty cool thing.
Fun to have an excuse to get your paintings published too.
There you go. Yeah. Well, this has been spectacular. It's run a little longer than I had promised you it would take, so my apologies. Thank you for the indulgence. Before I let you go, I'm hoping that you would be willing to recommend a book, something nature-based. So actually, I'm going to ask you to recommend a couple. 1, tell us about one of your books, and then 2, a book that you would recommend from a different author that you think the audience would be interested in or should be interested in.
Okay, well, the one that I'll recommend that I'm an author of is for any of your listeners who might be interested enough to dive deeply into the science of ornithology. I have co-edited a book with Irby Lovett, my colleague here at Cornell, called the Cornell Lab of Ornithology Handbook of Bird Biology. It's a serious book, but it's written in language that's accessible to any high school student or interested amateur.
We should get a signed copy of that for Ethan King.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a good idea. I will say that it's getting hard to secure a copy of it now because we are actually in the process right now of revising it, and so in another year or 2, the next edition is going to come out. Now, by the way, it has, if I can indulge me for a minute extra here, it has an interesting history because the original Handbook of Bird Biology or Guide to Bird Biology, the home study course in bird biology, was first written by Olin Sewell Pettengill when he was the director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in the late 1960s. So Pettengill produced this little sort of a magazine-like home study course for people interested in birds who wanted to kind of understand the basics of bird biology, bird physiology, bird anatomy, bird behavior. We worked hard to publish the second edition of that, which we eventually did in the mid-1990s, which was a huge, thick, 20-pound monster. And that was the second edition of the so-called home study course in bird biology. This third edition, which I just recommended, which I co-edited with Irby, love it, and Fitzpatrick. Really nice, lots of color pictures and color figures, and again, very accessible language, but covers the 15 chapters of bird biology. And it's the world's best single source on what we now know about the biology of birds, from their behavior and physiology and structure, migration, ecology, social organizations. The chapter I wrote particularly was on bird conservation, the last chapter. And that's a book that's now being, so the fourth edition of this thing that dates back to Pettengill's original. It will be published probably in 27.
Okay.
So you asked for another book, and I always love to recommend the book called The Beak of the Finch, written by last name Weiner, Weiner. Yeah,
Jonathan.
Forgive me. Jonathan. I should have remembered that. Jonathan Weiner. Traces the imaginative and exhausting work of the married couple Peter and Rosemary Grant, now emeritus professors at Princeton University, and their work on the Galapagos Islands on the Galapagos finches. And it's also a very, very accessible treatise on how evolution works. What is natural selection? What was it that Darwin discovered that was so fundamental to human thought in terms of our understanding of how the great diversity of living things came to be? And it uses the Grant's work on the Galapagos finches as the model example. It's a terrific read. So I recommend it to anybody who wants to get a little entry into the science of evolutionary biology, but doesn't want to go into the nitty-gritty details and all the genetics. By the way, back to our original topic, we talked about Florida scrub jays. A huge part of what we're doing nowadays in the last 10 to 15 years is looking at the genetics of this species and what it tells us about evolution at the genome level. Grant's work on the Galapagos finch, fantastic entry is The Beak of the Finch. We'll write a book someday on what we've learned about the Florida scrub jay from a behavioral standpoint, an ecological and conservation standpoint, to a genetic standpoint. Great model species, and maybe a great species to come full circle on in our conversation.
Well, that's fantastic. And you know what? This is a great time to wrap this one up. John, I have so many other things that I want to ask you that I'm gonna indulge myself by asking you to come back next year so we can have another conversation, because I've loved this. I'm going to throw my email up right now. If you've got questions for me, please send me an email. If you've got questions for John, send me an email and I'll forward it to John. And John, I'm going to put you in touch with Ethan. And maybe,
please, that's a good idea.
Maybe 50 years from now, he'll be doing one of these and saying, it was Mr. Fitzpatrick who, helped me. And anyway, we'll see what happens with that. If you're watching this on YouTube, please click the subscribe button. There's no cost. There's no time involved. We don't inundate you with stuff, but it gives us a chance to reach out and grow our audience and bring in more guests and do those things, which is great. Drop a comment or hit like, whatever you want to do. It'd be much appreciated. I'm going to follow this up with a field notes, which I always do. Something that I love. It's just my chance to go off for 6 or 7 minutes about something. And as I wrap this up, as I try to end every one of these things, first of all, John, thank you so much for your time and sharing the information. But when you're out there, man, stay safe and stay curious. Have a great day. Hello and welcome to Field Notes. Normally, I love doing these things. They're one of my favorite parts of the whole podcast program. But today's is a little bit sad, but I think it needs to be done. I think it's the appropriate thing to do. So today we're going to honor one of the giants, one of the greats of the natural world and those who study it, Jane Goodall. She died October 1st, and she was 91 years old and was an absolute monster, a pioneer, a leader by every definition. She was amazing. She brought empathy to science, or brought it to the forefront of science. She probably was not the first person to ever feel that. She opened the doors for the women who followed, and that was incredibly important. Primatologist Catherine Hobater said, "When I heard her speak, it transformed my view of science. I got to hear it was okay to feel something," which is incredible to think that wasn't the case before. But Jane Goodall made that okay. I've got a guest coming up in a couple of weeks by the name of Christine Webb. Christine is a writer now. She teaches at Harvard, and she has written a book called The Arrogant Ape, which has just come out or is about to come out. And it talks about a number of things. We are the arrogant apes, humans, but she talks about struggling early on in her educational career with caged primates and how she hated to do that and quit doing it. And I think that's a little bit of what Jane Goodall brought to the world. Jane was born in London in 1934. Her first trip to Tanzania was in July of 1960 at age 26. She went to study wild chimpanzees at the Gombe Stream National Park. And she went there alone. Dr. Lee sponsored her financially, at least in part, and opened that door for her. But Jane challenged women's roles in science and did that in an amazing way. Her initial findings were dismissed by many because she was young and a woman and didn't have the traditional educational background that those people who were at the time allowed to speak on those issues had. It was a very closed club, and she was not welcome for any number of reasons. No formal training, although she did in 1965 get her PhD in ethology. She disproved the conventional wisdom that only humans use tools, which we now know is not even close to being true, but it is one of those standards that we use to try to differentiate humans from all other animals. And none of those standards seem to work. Every time we come up with one, opposable thumbs or tools or language, whatever it might be, we find animals in the wild that can do all of those things, or at least some of those things. One of her early examples on tools was chimps using sticks to fish out termites. And one of the prejudices of people, we should talk about this for just a moment, is that we think that if a dolphin doesn't speak the way we do, or a humpback whale, or a chimpanzee doesn't use tools the way we do, or a raven doesn't use tools the way we do, that they're not right, but we're judging them by our standards. How many of us would survive if at 3 years old we were taken and dropped into the Serengeti? I would venture to say none, and yet some of these animals can do that. Humpback whales can communicate with each other, and just because they don't necessarily speak our language, they might be asking themselves, why don't we speak theirs? Same thing with dolphins and all kinds of stuff. So it's a balance, but Jane played a major role in opening those discussion points, which are now having shifts in the way that science is tackled. Science is one of those areas that moves very slowly with change, glacier-like pace, but it is moving. Some of the behaviors that Jane observed in her chimpanzees, her beloved chimpanzees, she allowed herself to love them, was aggression, mourning, activism, or altruism. I'm sorry, altruism, not activism. They were not there with signs. Social groups, and they were meat eaters. All of these things were new. From 1974 to 1978, she documented what became known as the Gombe War between two chimp communities who were both trying to slaughter and wipe out the other in a painful replication of what we do as human beings. In 1977, she founded the Jane Goodall Institute to protect chimps. And in 1991, she started something called Roots and Shoots, which is predominantly a youth initiative to bring young people into conservation, which is something we need a lot of, because if they don't pick up the stick that some of us have left behind, we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. Just this year, she was awarded the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is a spectacular honor, and congratulations to her for that. And she wrote a book called Reason for Hope, A Spiritual Journey. She wrote that in 1999. It's kind of an autobiography. It's her life story. It's her philosophy. It's her thoughts on the future. It's a pretty spectacular book. In 1971, she wrote something called In the Shadow of Man. I've not read that, but I understand it's a great book. In 1990, she wrote Through a Window, My 30 Years with the Chimpanzees of Gombe, and she's written many other books. I do want to point out that Cy Montgomery, who has been a guest on this podcast and is a guest in the upcoming book, Why We Love Birds, her first major book was in 1991. It was called Walking with the Great Apes, and it was about three of the pioneering women in naturalists and science. And that was Diane Fossey, that was by Ruth Galdikas, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Jane Goodall. So a sad day for Cy. We exchanged a couple of text messages last night, and it's painful for her to have lost a mentor and somebody that she looked up to. But these women were pioneering scientists. They were pioneering women, and setting that aside, They were towering figures, and Jane Goodall is to be applauded. Maybe take a moment and think about her and how difficult some of that might have been. It is not an unfair parallel to bring up Jackie Robinson breaking the race barrier in baseball and what he had to go through being shunned by what should have been his peers as she was. So it's a pretty neat deal. I want to thank you for listening. I want to say goodbye and thank you to Jane Goodall. If you get a chance and you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. It does help us reach more people, bring in more guests, share the message with more. Drop a comment, hit like, do whatever you want to do. And as always, if you're out there doing something, man, stay safe and stay curious. Have a great day.